This is the F-35 fighter jet, which human rights organisations have called a workhorse for Israel's brutal bombing campaign. The UK government recently announced the suspension of 30 arms licences out of 350 to Israel, but this excluded the UK components of the multinational F-35 programme, except we're going directly to Israel. Since 2015, the UK has provided hundreds of millions of pounds worth of military exports to Israel, which includes components for military aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and missiles. Having gathered information from a wide range of sources, from NGOs on the ground to media reports to military incident logs, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy says they've suspended certain licenses where there
does exist a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
So what does constitute a violation?
Warring parties must comply with the principle of distinction. They have to distinguish between civilians and combatants. They have to distinguish between civilian targets and military targets. So that's one rule. The second rule is that warring parties must comply with the requirement of taking precautionary measures. And last but not least, there is the principle of proportionality. So measures of any warring side must be proportionate.
Could you elaborate on what concerns there are over how Israel's potentially violated international humanitarian law?
Around 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, and it's reported that most of these casualties are civilians, women and children in particular. Around 2 million civilians have been displaced, and most of Gaza's residential houses, including hospitals and humanitarian zones, have been targeted and destroyed. And in response to these concerns, countries have been taking decisions. For example, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Australia and others have suspended their arms supplies and technology supplies to Israel.
It's believed the UK provides around 15% of components for the F-35s. Do we know how Israel is currently using these jets for their war in Gaza?
So there's not a great deal of information other than an acceptance that the F-35 is being used, which is understandable given the size of the Israeli Air Force and the specific intelligence capabilities that the aircraft possesses. So I would expect that they would be flying in the main close air support missions for Israeli troops on the ground. So standing off and then prosecuting targets that are being called in by forward air controllers on the ground.
Following the deadly Hamas attacks on the 7th of October last year, the Palestinian health authorities claim that more than 40,000 people have been killed by Israeli ground and air campaigns. Human rights organisations have criticised the UK government for not including the F-35s in their suspensions, and some claim that Israel has been using these jets to drop so-called mega bombs in Gaza. These bombs, they potentially are lethal within 300-metre radius. They can produce a 12-metre wide bomb crater. And the UN has said in the past that these bombs, they can rupture lungs, they can also rupture sinuses, tear off limbs, even 100 metres from the blast site. And they can also throw metal fragments a mile or more.
If they use the bombs at issue, the aircrafts at issue in a highly densely populated civilian area, mostly populated by women and children, young children, I think that raises very serious concerns of violations of international humanitarian law. And as I said earlier, some of the incidents reported suggest that there is a very credible concern that the violations of serious violations of humanitarian law might have occurred in the conflict involving the F-35s.
However, Israel has not disclosed the direct role of these jets in the war, and it's also incredibly difficult to gather conclusive evidence in an active conflict. So far, the government hasn't released any documentation on the decision-making processes behind the F-35s. However, the Foreign Office did tell Times Radio that the F-35 program has a significant dependence on the UK, and any suspension to Israel is not possible without undermining the program overall, which in turn would have a significant impact on international peace and security. As David Lammy said,
the global F-35 supply chain that is vital for the security of the UK, our allies and NATO.
So the F-35 is the biggest current aircraft program that exists within the West. The primary users are the United States. So the United States Air Force, as I mentioned earlier, using the F-35A, the United States Navy using the carrier variant, the 35C, and the US Marine Corps uses both the B, the vertical takeoff, and the C variant. So they're by far the largest user of the aircraft. But it's also used by a number of NATO nations as well, obviously the UK being one, and a number of other countries around the world, for example, the Israelis and the Australians. So the procurement process for the F-35 is quite well known, and the spares for the aircraft are managed through what's called a global spares pool, and each country contributes spare parts that it manufactures, and also it purchases the governments of each aircraft purchase a certain number of spares, which then go into that spares pool. That pool can then be drawn upon by all of the users of the F-35. The reason for doing that is to provide the most flexible support solution to any demand that comes up. Now, in addition to that, countries can and do maintain a specific spares pool of their own that they have purchased. So, for example, the spares that the UK deploys on its aircraft carriers are probably spares that it has purchased and owns outright. But the vast majority of spares come from the global spares pool. So I'm not sure that it's accurate to say that the UK is providing spares directly to Israel. As far as I'm aware, the UK is providing spares into the global spares pool, and Israel is able to draw on that global spares pool in the same way as every other F-35 users.
The Foreign Office also said, "We consider that the exceptional issues arising in relation to the F-35 program relating to the maintenance of international peace and security require the specific measures that the government announced yesterday."